Hello, and welcome to this video tutorial of Realm Raiders, a 2 to 4 player miniature and very chaotic war game. So, to set up the game you need the following items. You'll need several printouts of the sets of cards. This is the set of cards here. You will need to make yourself a board. The board has to be a 6x6 grid with the 4x4 mid area marked out. This mid area is called the battlefield. The corners will also have to be crossed out as they will not be used during the game, and these blue areas around the edges are known as the portal zones. You need to dedicate a portal zone to each player. If you are playing 2 players, the portal zones dedicated to each player should be across from each other. You will need a first player token. You will need several wound tokens. I would suggest making some or using some dice for this purpose. Once you have all of the cards cut out, you will need to make 2 decks. One unit deck of 50 cards. The actual numbers of each card that should be in the deck are in the rulebook. You can check that out. And the latter 8 cards here are the spells, and you'll need to make a deck of those of 30 cards. Again, numbers that you require for the basic game are in the spellbook. You can alter these numbers later if you feel like it. Then, once all these decks are made, you need to give them a good shuffle, and then deal 4 unit cards and 2 spell cards to each player. Now that's all decided, all you need to do is pretty much get ready for the game. Have a look over the cards and make your first plans of what you're going to do. So the game is divvied up into turns. Each turn has 2 phases: the action phase and the activation phase. The action phase is the time when players get actions. If you're playing a 3 to 4 player game, you get 1 action each. If you're playing a 2-player game, you get 2 actions each. The first player starts and plays all their actions, and then going around the table in a clockwise direction, each player does all their actions in turn. Then you move on to the activation phase. Again, starting from the first player, you go around the table playing each of these activations in turn. Note that all table sides will get an activation phase, not just players. So, the first thing that happens in the activation phase is you ready and cast spells. You process clashes, and you process movement. Actions can be used to place units on the table, or attach spells to spellcasting units. So, after both phases have been completed, the first player token needs to pass on to the next table edge, going clockwise around the table. Don't forget, it needs to be passed on to edges even if there's no player sitting there, and each player needs to draw back up to 6 cards. Sometimes you'll be able to play more cards than just 1 or 2, so make sure you have 6 in hand before the next turn begins. So, starting with actions. During the action phase, like I said, you can place units as 1 action. You can place units on any table side that you are currently sitting at, or is dedicated to you, and the table sides to your left and to your right. So this player here can place any unit in any of the locations with a tick mark on it in this example. To note, any units that are placed will always face across from the table. So all the units placed on the left-hand side here will face across the table towards the right, whereas any units placed at the top of the table will face south across the table. And at this point, I should point out that this player is considered to control any units facing away from them. So any units facing to the right across the table here are owned by or controlled by this player. Whereas any units they place on the top or bottom, they don't control. They will be controlled by the player who owns that table side. Attaching spells. You can attach any spell, which is, like I said, any card which doesn't have numbers in the corners to any spellcasting unit. You can tell which units are spellcasting units by the bottom left-hand corner of a unit card. The bottom left-hand corner of a unit card will normally not have a symbol in it. Like, for example, it will not have a symbol in it. You can only place or attach spells to units which are facing directly away from you. And again, any units that you control. And you can place them on any unit on the battlefield that, like I said, you can control. So this player could place a spell on this ritualist here, or this spell sword here, but they cannot place a spell on this sorcerer, or this spell sword, as they are facing in different directions than the player's control direction. After all these actions have been done, we move on to the activation phase. This is how you attach and ready spells. There's 3 different types of spellcasters in the game. There is the Ritualist, which is this top one here. They take 2 turns to ready spells. There is the Summoner, who takes 1 turn to ready spells, but is a bit worse combat-wise. And there is the Spell Sword, which you can attach a spell, but they don't ready or cast spells normally. When you attach a spell to a Ritualist, you put the spell horizontal and face down on them. After a turn, or after you go through the ready subphase of the activation phase, you flip it face up, but keep it horizontal. The second time you go through this subphase, you turn it to be vertical. And the third time you go through this phase, you actually get to cast the spell. The Sorcerer readies things a lot quicker, so you start it in the horizontal face-up position, again going to the vertical face-up position next, and then casting it. To note, there is some spells which take 1 turn less to prepare, and if they do, you immediately skip the first section of this. So if it took 1 turn less to prepare for a Ritualist, then you immediately jump to the face-up horizontal, whereas the Sorcerer, you'd immediately jump to the face-up vertical, which means that if you attach a spell to the Sorcerer with 1 turn less to prepare, the first ready or casting subphase, you'll be able to cast the spell. Spell swords are different, and the reason why they're different is because they don't ready or cast spells normally, but they cast spells that are attached to them whenever they are considered to be in a clash. I'll get back to clashes shortly, but let's just say that any time they are in combat, whether the attacker or the defender, they cast the spell on whoever they are fighting with. This can happen if the spell is face down on them, which is what happens when you attach a spell to a spell sword, or if it's face up on them, which is what happens if a spell gets cast on a spell sword. Then we move on to the Declaring Clashes subphase. Declaring Clashes is fairly simple. Look at all characters, or all units on the board which are under your control, and have an attack value, or some sort of attack ability. If they have somebody who is not friendly, some unit that is not friendly in front of them, then they will clash with that unit. So, for example, this Ritualist has 1 attack power, or 1 damage, which means that they will do 1 damage to this Barbarian in a clash. They will place a token on them. This Sorcerer doesn't have an attack value. It has an attack value of 0, so it will do no damage to this defender and is considered not to be clashing. This defender has a friendly unit in front of them, as they both face the same direction, so this defender does not consider to clash with this diplomat. This diplomat has a special ability which happens on clashes, but he will clash with this swordsman. This swordsman is not under this player's control, so you will not clash with this defender, at least not yet anyway. And finally, this defender will clash with the swordsman, as they are not friendly, and of course this defender has 1 attack power, meaning that this swordsman will receive 1 wound. After all clashes are declared, and all wounds have been placed, any unit with a number of wounds equal to or more than their health value, which is in the bottom right of their card, will be removed from the table. Then we move on to moving units. Moving units is fairly simple. Basically, any unit will move forward as long as they normally do move forward, and they will be moving into an open space or a space that will be unoccupied after someone else moves. So, the sorcerer and ritualist do not move, ever. That's why this little symbol's in the top right hand corner. They will stay put and will not move. This barbarian will of course move 1 space forward, and these two, this defender and this diplomat, will move in a chain. This diplomat will move forward to this space, and this defender will move up behind him. This defender will not move because there is not an open space in front of him. Now, anytime a unit moves up to a board edge and is facing a board edge, means that they will cause a wound to a player. For example, this defender will move from this portal zone into this corner zone. Like I said, this corner zone is not usually used, but units can move across portal zones and sometimes into corner zones, causing wounds to players. As this unit will be moving into this corner zone and facing this table edge, the player on this side of the table, to the right, will take 1 wound. Another note is if a unit moves onto a table edge and is facing the table edge and has a spell attached, that spell will cause another wound. Units will only ever do 1 wound, whereas units with a spell attached will always do 2. When a player takes 3 wounds, they are considered eliminated from the game. The way you win the game is being the last player not eliminated. An eliminated player can no longer take actions, and if they would ever be controlling a unit that would cast a spell that would give them a choice, that spell is instead discarded. So let's talk about the units and their special abilities. These 3 units at the top are fairly simple. They don't have any special abilities and will march straight across the field, doing damage as they go. The swordsman has 2 attack and 3 defense. These are your basic units, and usually will be in 2 combats before they are defeated, sometimes more, sometimes less. The barbarian is a very glass cannon unit. They have 3 attack and 1 health. So if they hit something, it'll usually die, but if they're hit at all, they will be removed from the board. The defender is the shield unit, and will usually just be a blockade for anything coming towards you. It has 1 attack strength and 5 defense. They're the only unit in the game which has a number higher than 3. Then we go on to the second set of units down here. These are the spellcasters. We've already talked about spellcasting, but let's just quickly go over their numbers. The Ritualist has 1 attack and 3 defense, and basically this means that they can get into combat and be a bit of a blockade, but they do take longer to cast spells than the Sorcerer, and they also do not move at all. They'll always stay where they're put. The Sorcerer, like I said, is faster, but has worse stats. It will never do damage to anyone or cause clashes, and will always die on the first hit, as they only have 1 health. Again, they cannot move, but, like I said, very fast at spellcasting. Spell swords are the only spellcasters that can move and cast spells. And even though they can move and cast spells, they still don't have great stats. They do 1 damage and do have 2 health. But like I said, any spell attached to them will be triggered whenever combat happens. So say this spell sword attacked and hit a swordsman, they would do 1 damage, causing 1 wound. But if they had a spell on them, that spell would also trigger against that swordsman. It's the same if the opposite happens. If this swordsman attacks this spell sword, this spell sword would take 2 damage, but whatever spell was on the spell sword would also be triggered against this swordsman. Next we go to the scout. Now the scout's a bit of a tricky one, because they can sneak by and move 2 spaces. The scout, if they can, will always move 2 spaces ahead, but not cause any clashes. This also happens if there is a unit in their way, meaning that they'll just basically sneak straight through them. If they can't move 2 spaces, then they will move 1 or 0 spaces and then do clashes and movement normally. This always happens during the clash step, so if they move 2 spaces, they won't get a clash or another move. For example, in this third example here, they'll move forward 1 space, then they will do clashes and movement normally, meaning that they'll do 2 damage to this barbarian, killing it, and then move straight onto that space. In this example, they can't move at all because there's no spaces in front of them. There's no 1 or 2 spaces in front of them that is empty. So they'd basically just clash with this barbarian, kill it, and then move. Diplomats are the chaos bringers to the table. Anytime they clash with an enemy, they turn it they turn it 90 degrees clockwise. If this means that the unit turns to the same direction as the diplomat, that means that unit also gets a clash and move that turn. So for example, this diplomat changed this swordsman to face the same direction as this diplomat, meaning that this swordsman will clash with anything that's above it and do damage to that, and then everything might move forward if there was no space up there. If a diplomat ever receives wounds, however, instead of taking wounds, if they ever have wounds placed on them, remove those wounds and turn it 90 degrees clockwise, no matter how many wounds they took. Let's get on to spells. There's 8 spells in the game, and they all do something fairly simple. This 3-star spell always does 3 damage. When it's cast, it can be cast on any unit on the board, unless cast by a spell sword, in which case the spell's target's already declared. But you can choose any unit on the board and do 3 damage to them. Again, if this takes the unit off the board, if this means that they have more wounds on them than they're equal to, or more wounds on them than their health, they can be removed from the board. This spell does 1 damage to a unit. However, it takes 1 less turn to prepare. So, for example, if you were to place the spell on a sorcerer, it would be immediately ready to cast, and can be cast the next spellcasting step. This spell is fairly simple. This is a might spell. Might doesn't do anything on the board, but when the unit exits the board and does damage to a player, it means that they will take 2 damage. This might spell can be cast on any unit on the board at all. Doesn't matter if it's friendly or otherwise. Note that if any spell that is attached to a unit is attached to a spellcaster, that spell is also considered ready to cast next turn and can be cast again. If it's attached to a spell sword, it means that anything that attacks them, or they attack, will get the spell next turn instead. This spell is fairly simple. When it's cast, target a unit on the board, then choose to turn it clockwise or anti-clockwise by 90 degrees. This one over here, this U-turn spell, will immediately turn a unit 180 degrees around, and is then attached to that unit. The only difficulty with the spell is the fact that once they're turned around, they cannot move. They will stay put until the spell is either removed or they die. This spell down here is the Dispel spell. If it's cast on a unit with a spell attached, that spell is immediately removed. This can be used against spellcasters or any unit that has an enchantment spell, like this U-turn spell, for example, or the Might one we saw earlier. Again, this is one turn quicker to cast than most spells, so attaching it to a sorcerer means that it can be almost instantly used. Next we have the teleport spell. This one's fairly difficult to explain, so I'll quickly explain this using this board. The way this works is once the spell is cast, you can use it on any adjacent unit or any unit that is casting this spell. So for example, this sorcerer can cast this teleport spell on either of these defenders or himself. The difficulty with the spell is, although it moves any unit it's cast on 2 spaces forward, if it lands on another unit, both those units are immediately removed from the board. No damage taken, just completely gone. This final spell means that next turn, once it's cast, the player who controls the unit that cast it will next turn gain 1 additional action. And that's it. That's all the spells and units in the game. So, in quick summary. To play the game, each player takes their actions. They can either place units or attach spells with their actions. Then, passing around the table clockwise, the next player can then place units or attach spells. Then the activation phase happens. The first player will go through all these processes and then the next table edge will do all these processes. If there's no player at a table edge, then somebody will have to take on the role of going through these processes for that table edge. If that table edge does not have a player or has an eliminated player and would cast a spell that gives that player or table edge a choice, then that spell is discarded instead. After all players have gone through these processes, may I add that the clashes and movement aren't choices, they happen automatically. After all these things have happened, the first player token goes around the table 1 step clockwise to the next table edge, and then everybody redraws their cards, and a new round begins. Once a player takes 3 wounds, they're eliminated, and if everybody but 1 player is eliminated, that 1 player wins. Thank you for watching this video tutorial of Realm Raiders. Hope you give it a try, and I would love to see some comments.